Hi, welcome back. Today let's talk about the lead up to the American Revolution. So far we've talked about a certain nationalism that is being created here in the colonies with the Great Awakening, the unifying Seven Years' War, or the French Indian War, also known as. Um, so let's just dive into the actual lead up, the resistance, the Americans' animosity, the American colonists' animosity towards Great Britain, the mother country. And in doing so, we need to first start off with a certain economic theory or philosophy called mercantilism. Mercantilism you may have run into during your high school economics class or possibly history. And mercantilism is basically a economic philosophy of the 17th and 18th century empires. The empire, the mother country, Great Britain, France, Spain to an extent, they believed mercantilism was the best route for them to go. And basically, what it means is colonies are there only to enrich the mother country. So, Spain's colonies, Great Britain's colonies, France's colonies, the colonies are there only to enrich the mother country, to make the mother country better, wealthier. What mercantilism does, it does place restrictions on the colonies here in the New World, the American colonies, the British colonies, excuse me. Um, in fact, the mother country will place restrictions on what the colonies could manufacture. You didn't have a say in what you wanted to make. If you wanted to make something in Massachusetts, let's say grandfather clocks, if the mother country had too many grandfather clock manufacturers, let's say back in England, they would say, no, you can't do that. You'll be competing with the mother country manufacturing. In addition, even if you were to make something that was viable here in the New World, you had to use the ships that they would let you use. You had to use ships that were probably had the the Great Britain flag, the Union Jack. You were kind of restricted on who you could use to transport your product. And lastly, you also couldn't trade with whomever you wanted to trade with. As a producer here in the New World, you were limited on who you could sell to. Uh, in fact, you were limited by way of decree from the mother country saying you're not allowed to trade with, let's say, the Portuguese or the Spanish, uh, depending on the product, of course, but uh, restrictions on your freedom regarding business. Now, the reason for this, British merchants back in the home country wanted American colonists to buy British goods. They didn't want to buy from other countries, and a lot of times not even from themselves, from other colonies, especially not the French, the Spanish, or the Dutch products. They did not want that. In theory, Americans would pay duties on imported goods to discourage this practice. So if American colonists actually wanted to buy something made out of Spain or out of France, they would have to pay an additional amount, a duty. We'll actually see the rise of smuggling is a good way that the colonists get around this. So, in fact, ships coming from countries that they weren't allowed to trade with or purchase from, ships would probably not come to the official port, but maybe a couple miles down the coastline where they could unload, and the English crown would never know. So we see the rise of smuggling, which will of course come in handy later on in the colony's history with the American Revolution. Now let's talk about empire, which goes hand in hand with mercantilism, right? British Empire is huge, and this is map. It's a very beautiful map, but it kind of everywhere that Britain has a colony. In fact, the saying is the sun never sets on the British Isles, meaning that they are everywhere in the world. So it's always sunny somewhere that there's a British colony. Uh, and in fact, prior to 1763, the British followed a policy known as salutary neglect. I don't expect you to remember the term, but I want you to kind of get an idea what that means. Is that they'll pass laws regulating colonial trade, but they know they can't enforce them, right? As such a big, big empire, can you have a police force everywhere? Can you be inspecting every ship to make sure that your colonies are trading with only the people they're supposed to be trading with? In fact, it would cost the British Empire four times as much in regard to their British Navy to collect those duties, those taxes, as the value of the taxes or the duties themselves. So it didn't make sense financially for them to try to enforce all these regulations they have. And the colonists here in New England, they ignored these laws. They didn't pay attention to them. And in fact, ships from the colonies often loaded their goods with other illegal goods from the French and the Dutch and the Spanish West Indies. In fact, British custom officials here in the New World soon found their pockets stuffed with bribe money from colonial shippers who would, kind of grease the wheels there to make sure that their products got out or that they could buy certain products. And the custom officials would look the other way for a little taste, right, for a bribe. Uh, and in fact, smugglers that were caught, they were brought before American juries, American colonist juries, who often would free them with little ramifications. So smuggling was commonplace. Everyone knew about it. People were getting bribes. The British Crown was too big to do anything about it yet. And I want to stress the smuggling aspect of this because American shippers will become really, really good at avoiding the British Navy, a practice that they'll use extensively in the American Revolutionary War. This is one of my favorite slides here. It's a little young lady that not too happy. And the quote here is, "Woe to the parent who attempts to contain the child who has been allowed to roam free." If any of you have nieces or nephews or sons or daughters or just friends of the family at this age, we all know that the parent who attempts to say no to a child that they've been saying yes or kind of letting them do whatever they want, that child is going to push back. And we kind of see that here in the New World. All of a sudden, after over a century and a half of permitting relative self-rule to the colonies, Britain starts to exercise direct influence over colonial life. In addition to restricting westward movement with that proclamation of 1763 we talked about, I believe, last module, where telling colonists you can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains, the parent company, Great Britain, is actually going to start enforcing its trade laws. Remember, Great Britain is in debt. It needs money, and it's going to have to start enforcing all these regulations, these laws, and starting attempting to get these duties. I talked about those bribery, the bribery of the officials at the ports, those bribes from the customs officials. And in fact, most officials don't even go on the ships as they come in to check to see what's coming in. Well, we'll see Great Britain give general search warrants. They're actually known as writs of assistance to their British customs inspectors, allowing them to search any colonial ship they'd like. Inspectors had long been charged with that directly, but never carried that out. Now we start to see them enforce it. British customs inspectors are actually told you need to go on the ships. And in fact, instead of people being caught smuggling, American colonists, instead of them going in front of a jury of their peers, fellow colonials, now if they're caught, they're actually brought before a British admiralty court, basically British officials, either military or in the government of some sort. And worst of all, the British now begin levying taxes against American colonists directly. Not necessarily on goods, but on goods that you would expect, your sugar and other staples. We see other types of taxes, also known as acts, A-C-T-S. And the first one I want to talk about is a Stamp Act. It's basically a tax stamp. Any piece of paper, official document, newspaper, even playing cards had to have the official crown, the official stamp on it, which of course they would charge you to put on it. Britain had several stamps to mark documents as official. Now, I mentioned that Britain is in debt, and they're in debt because they're an empire, right? Trying to maintain the empire. We talked about it. Anytime you fight a war, wars are expensive. So after the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, had been completed, we realized it was very costly. And the taxes asked of the American colonists actually were lower than those asked of British citizens in Great Britain. So it didn't seem unfair to the British to ask the colonists to help pay for for the war, right? Um, the revenue raised from taxing the colonies was used to pay for their own defense. In addition, there's still military units here in the colonies. The colonies are British holdings, right? So technically, all the colonists are British citizens. They are British citizens. They have a defense. It's paid for by the crown. So therefore, they should pay taxes to help fund that. The Americans will see things differently, though, right? From one of your readings, in fact, Benjamin Franklin will testify about the Stamp Act. I won't go into too much detail because you've read that. Uh, but you start to see the colonists see all these actions as inherently unfair. And in addition, I mentioned that, well, the colonists should be paying because they have uh, these uh, these needs regarding defense and what have you. But the cons ask, well, why are we maintaining British garrisons, troops in the colonies now that the war is over? The French are gone. The French are gone. We have the Native American threat underhand. Why are we supporting having the military in our towns? And why are we paying for that? Now, I mentioned England pays more in taxes, but Americans believe that may be true, but they're paying more in sweat. They're clearing the lands, they're controlling the native population, and many of them, including friends, family, have died helping to build colonies here in the British Empire. They really see further taxation as really insulting. And here we see the colonists start to make a political argument which is quite unique, which we're probably all familiar with, that the tradition of receiving permission for levying taxes dates back hundreds of years in British history. That the crown or the government had to actually get permission to levy a tax. That's British history. But the colonists will argue they have no representation in the British Parliament. And I know we've all heard taxation without representation. Well, here's where it comes into play. They deem to tax them without offering any representation is to deny them their traditional rights as English subjects. This could not stand to them, right? Uh, if you're going to tax us but you don't give us representation, then we are not really Englishmen, right? We're not traditional English subjects. That Stamp Act I mentioned earlier was not the first attempt to tax the American colonies. Parliament, i.e., the British government, had passed the Sugar Act and the Currency Act the previous year, uh, but those taxes were collected at the ports, and they were easily circumvented. Like I mentioned, ships would just go a couple miles down the coast to unload. But these are also indirect taxes where the consumer really didn't feel it, because if there was a tax on sugar, well, when the person bought sugar at the store, it just was another penny more. You didn't know that there was a penny more added into there because of these taxes. But the Stamp Act in March of 1765, which I mentioned, this changes. This is a direct tax on colonists, right? Colonists feel it. If they want to get married, they need to have a certain documentation. They're going to have to pay that extra amount for that stamp, for deeds, for wills, for any sort of contract. They're going to have to directly pay that. So this is the first direct tax on the colonists. Now, I want to talk about the Quartering Act a bit. We had mentioned the British military still here in the colonies to defend the colonies and the colonists, or that is their argument. But it's expensive to keep a military force away from its home base or from Great Britain, right? Uh, so the Quartering Act is basically requiring American colonies to provide food and shelter for British troops. The colonists are extremely upset about this act. And in fact, in this painting, you see British colonies, or I'm sorry, British troops. They're going to commandeer this house, and in the lower left-hand corner, you have the family, very sad that they're being thrown out of their house so that they have to house these British military soldiers. Uh, Probably more propaganda than anything. Now, true, there are instances where British soldiers are housed, but it was more along the lines of maybe a place that was rented out rooms. It wasn't a matter of kicking out colonists and out of their house. But still, it's an important aspect of colonists start to see the British Empire, their government at this point, starting to take advantage of them, or they feel being taken advantage. There's actually a nervous tension here in the colonies. The relationship between the American colonies and England in the aftermath of the Stamp Act and those other acts I mentioned is creating an animosity, a nervous tension here. We see America start to pull away. Not necessarily a full-blown revolution, but they start to pull away. This gentleman is Lord Townshend. And Lord Townshend, he believes that the colonies have gone a little too far. Uh, Lord Townshend persuades the House of Commons to once again tax the Americans. This time he wants a tax on glass, paper, lead, and tea. So these items that Americans, colonists, excuse me, purchase will have a tax on them to help raise revenues for the crown, for the British government. And in fact, part of the money raised from these taxes would pay for colonial governors. These would be governors appointed by the crown or the government to directly look over the colonies. Traditionally, the legislature of the colonies would pay the governor's salary, but if you're being paid by local colonists, you tend to do what they like. So if the crown, the British government, pays the governor's salary directly, then the governor is not beholden to the colonists. And in fact, once this leverage is removed, the governors are freer to oppose actions done by the colonists. In fact, Lord Townshend will go even further and appoint an American Board of Customs Commissioners. This body would be stationed in the colonies to enforce the compliance with tax policy. So once again, another layer of customs officials to make sure no one is smuggling and they're paying all the taxes and the duties. And in fact, these customs officials will receive bonuses if they convict a smuggler. So we start to see the British Crown starting to bring the hammer down regarding taxes, duties, cracking down on smuggling. We start to see Americans, of course, respond by really an animosity, a bitterness, not necessarily a hate. They still consider themselves British subjects. Kind of wondering, why is the crown doing this to us? Why are they harassing us? Why is the military here? Why are they kicking us out of our homes? Lord Townshend and the Townshend Acts kind of presses up, amplifies this tension. Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams is a man of the people in Massachusetts. And in fact, we all know him from, I believe he's the Sam Adams beer. But Samuel Adams, in 1768, he will voice opposition to taxation without representation. And he'll write a letter, he'll pen a letter that says this very eloquently, and he sends this letter throughout the colonies to colonial legislatures, inviting them to unite in their actions against the British. In response, the British government will warn colonial legislatures to treat that letter with contempt, and they'll actually threaten dissolution of any legislative body that adheres to Samuel Adams' plea, Massachusetts' plea, who he's representing. His words fell on deaf ears as assemblies throughout the colonies, they will actually not pay attention to the British government, and New York, Rhode Island, New Jersey will accept the petition set forth by Samuel Adams in Massachusetts. So Great Britain, although warning the colonies, don't pay attention to this Massachusetts letter by Sam Adams, the colonies will accept this petition. Now, the tighter the British group grows, and if you see a theme here, we see the British keep on adding duties, adding taxes, starting to be more harsh, more punishing. Some historians wonder, why are they doing this? Don't they see they're actually kind of going to cause some escalation, some explosion, right, which we all know is going to come down the pike. But the British government doesn't see that. Now, British merchants, they actually are kind of in a bind because they begin to feel the sting of the colonies start to push back. The colonies will start to not buy goods by British manufacturers, by British merchants. And in fact, British merchants actually see their revenues start to go down. The British merchants will actually push the British government to pull back on all the rhetoric, on all the duties, on all the harshness, because it's affecting their bottom line. Now, although we still hadn't, there's still the fighting between American Minutemen and the British Redcoats will not begin for a while. We still see that animosity revved up. Parliament's Minister on American Affairs will order 4 regiments of Redcoats, their regular army troops, to Boston. Samuel Adams, still around, and several others will not take this lightly. Less than 3 weeks prior to the arrival of these British troops, Bostonians defiantly but nervously will assemble. And when the Redcoats march boldly through the town of Boston on October 1st, the only resistance seen, though, is on the facial expressions of the townspeople. The people of Boston had decided to show restraint. Now, the other 12 colonies watching the Boston proceedings are starting to fear that British tyranny is starting to come down the road here in the colonies. And in fact, moderates here in the colonies who thought, well, the crown is the crown, it's not too bad, they actually are starting to move more towards these radical patriots, these American patriots that resent and actually want to fight the British in one way or the other. So even moderates found it difficult to argue in favor of the king. Throughout the occupation of these Redcoats, the British Army in Boston, we start to see sentiment shift further and further away from the London government. More and more colonists see, yeah, the British government is going too far. They have their military stationed here, the taxes, the harsh penalties regarding manufacturing. We see the tide start to turn. On March 5th, 1770, the inevitable would happen. A mob of about 60 angry townspeople in Boston will descend upon the guard at the customs house. When reinforcements are called, the crowd become unrulier, hurling rocks and snowballs at the guard, the British Guard, and their reinforcements. In the heat of the confusion, the British will fire without command. So the officers didn't command the British military to fire upon the crowd. Bullets took the lives of 5 men, including Crispus Attucks, a former slave, and others are injured. The captain of the guard, Captain Preston of the British Guard, and his 4 men will be tried, and they pretty much are all cleared of their charges. 2 others are convicted of manslaughter, but were sentenced to a mere branding of their thumbs, kind of a barbaric type of punishment, but I would take that over death, of course. The interesting part is the lawyer who represents the British soldiers is none other than the patriot John Adams, and in fact we all know will become our 2nd president. At the same time that the British are drawing blood in Boston with the Boston Massacre, the Parliament in London is deciding once again whether or not to concede on the issue of taxation and repeal them. And they actually repeal pretty much all those taxes that I mentioned earlier that we've talked about, except for one. And of course that one is tea. It actually will prove to be an error in judgment on the part of the British. They should have repealed them all. But they will repeal all the taxes other than tea. We've got to remember that because, as we all know, this will lead to one of those most famous points in our history. I don't know if it deserves that spot, but tea is a very important commodity. Of course, the British love their tea, and the British colonists, American colonists, love their tea also. Now, the British East India Company, which is a famous trading company during this time period, is on the brink of financial collapse. And the British will hatch a scheme to deal simultaneously with the British East India Company's failing corporation and the problem of taxing the colonies. They will decide to grant this company, the British East India Company, a trading monopoly with the American colonies, meaning they are the only ones that will be able to sell tea in the Americas. A tax on the tea would be maintained, but the company would actually be able to sell its tea for a price that was a little lower than before. A monopoly doesn't allow for competition, as we all know, and so the British East India Company could lower its prices. But the colonists don't see it that way. The British are hoping that the colonists would be happy to get cheaper tea and pay the tax, but the colonists do not see it that way. This would have the dual result of saving the tea company, but also losing the Americas. The colonists saw this really as a thinly veiled plot to encourage tax payment. And further, they wondered how long would this monopoly last and the prices stay low. Their belief is that this British East India Company, while the price may drop a bit, eventually they're going to raise it, especially since they're the only player. Activists, patriots are, of course, advocating boycott, don't drink the tea. Many went further. In fact, they would actually threaten ships' captains coming into the ports that don't even think about unloading your product here. Several ships' captains are tar and feathered. In fact, in one case in Annapolis, citizens will burn the ship that the tea carried. From one of your readings, Philadelphia threatens tea men. This is actually described. And Boston, of course, reacts in a similarly extreme fashion. The governor of the colony, Thomas Hutchinson, will allow 3 ships carrying tea to enter Boston Harbor. But before that tax can be collected, Bostonians took action. And on a cold December night, the townspeople, the patriots, will storm the ships and toss 342 chests of tea into the water. They'll be disguised as Native Americans, so they wouldn't be identified, although everyone knew who it was. Now, the damage in modern American dollars to that product, the tea that's being dumped overboard, actually today's dollars would exceed about $750,000. So don't think of tea as a cheap product that it really didn't do anything. No, this is a serious offense. Not a single British East India Company chest of tea bound for the colonies would ever reach its destination. Now the British will respond because this is hierarchy. I mean, this is a terroristic act, right? For all lack of better words. They'll respond with the coercive acts. Just think of also known the intolerable acts. They will close Boston Harbor down until the British East India Trade Company is compensated. Only food and firewood would be permitted into the port. Town meetings are banned, and the authority of the royal governor is increased. And to add insult to injury, a General Gage, a British commander of North American forces, is appointed to the governorship of Massachusetts. He's a hardcore British general, which most Massachusetts patriots do not like. Throughout the colonies, the message is clear. What could happen in Massachusetts could happen anywhere. Had the British gone too far, supplies were sent to the beleaguered colony from the other 12. So the other 12 colonies are sending supplies to Massachusetts under this time period. For the first time since that Stamp Act, an intercolonial conference is called. It's under these circumstances that the First Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. Americans could not break their ties with Great Britain easily. Despite all the recent hardships, the majority of colonists since birth were reared to believe that England was to be loved and its king or queen revered. In addition, Americans feared breaking away because a revolution could bring mob rule, and no one, not even the mob, wanted that. Furthermore, despite all the taxes I've spoken of and the acts and the conditions, times were still good in the colonies. Arguments can actually be made that the average American was more prosperous than the average British citizen. Yet, there were the terrible injustices the colonists could not forget. Arguments for independence were growing, and Thomas Paine, the gentleman in the slide, would help give those arguments a growing forward push. Thomas Paine will write the instant bestseller Common Sense. Published in January of 1776 in Philadelphia, nearly 120,000 copies are in circulation by April of that same year. Paine's brilliant arguments are very straightforward. He argues two main points. First point, of course, is independence from England. His second point is the creation of a democratic republic. Paine will write in language of the people, so he's not going to use a lot of words or verbiage that most average colonists don't understand. In fact, he'll quote from the Bible in his arguments. Most people in America had a working knowledge of the Bible, so his arguments ring true. In fact, Paine is not very religious, but he knows his readers were. Paine will compare King George to the Pharaoh of England. This would touch a nerve in the American countryside. Now, his call for an establishment of a democratic republic is quite radical, and in fact, future patriotic leaders like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams will actually condemn Thomas Paine as an extremist. But his prose does make sense. His questioning of why should tiny England rule the vastness of this continent? His question, how can colonists expect to gain foreign support while still professing a loyalty to the British king? How much longer can Americans stand for the repeated abuses of the king? All these questions led many readers to one answer in the summer of 1776. It was common sense.